Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into the weeds with the transmission control protocol TCP.
That's right.
You've sent over some great material, covered some
Yeah.
really advanced concepts, and even interview prep stuff. So our mission today is to really dig in, figure out how TCP actually works under the hood.
Yeah, peel back the layers.
Exactly. Uncover some of the surprising details and what it all means for things like network speed and just making sure things don't break.
Absolutely. It's the workhorse, really. We want to understand what makes it so dependable for, well, pretty much everything we do online.
Okay, let's dive right in then. A basic but crucial one, TCP versus UDP. We hear these all the time. What's the fundamental difference? Why pick one over the other?
Okay, think of it like sending a message. TCP is like making a phone call. You dial, you wait for them to pick up, you confirm you're connected, that's the handshake.
Right.
Then you talk, and you know they heard you because they respond, or you repeat yourself if needed. It's connection-oriented, reliable. UDP, on the other hand, is more like shouting across a room, or maybe sending a postcard. You just send it out.
Fire and forget.
Exactly. You hope it gets there. Maybe it gets there out of order. Maybe parts get lost. No confirmation. It's connectionless, unreliable.
So what's the trade-off then? Why ever use UDP if it's unreliable?
Speed, mostly. Setting up and managing that TCP phone line takes overhead. SYN packets, ACKs, keeping state, UDP just sends. So for things like streaming video sometimes or online games where speed is critical and losing a tiny bit of data isn't the end of the world, UDP can be better.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's focus on TCP's phone line. How does it actually set that up reliably? That's the famous three-way handshake, isn't it?
Yep, the three-way handshake. It's pretty elegant, actually.
Walk us through it. SYN, SYN, ACK, ACK.
Okay, so first, the client, the one wanting to connect, sends a packet with the SYN flag set. Think of it as, hey, I want to synchronize start a connection.
SYN for synchronize.
The server, if it's listening on that port and accept the connection, replies with a packet that has both the SYN and the ACK flags set. SYN, ACK.
So it's saying, I hear you, and I also want to synchronize.
Exactly. It's acknowledging the client's SYN, that's the ACK part, and sending its own SYN request. And crucially, both sides include their starting sequence number in these SYN packets.
Ah, the sequence numbers. We'll get to those. What's the third step?
The client receives the SYN ACK, and it sends back a final packet with just the ACK flag set. This acknowledges the server's SYN,
Okay.
and once that ACK is received by the server, boom, connection established. Both sides know the other is ready, and they've agreed on the starting sequence numbers for their respective data flows.
So it's not just establishing that there's a connection, but also how they'll number the conversation.
Precisely. That synchronization of sequence numbers is absolutely vital for the reliability part.
Let's talk more about those sequence and acknowledgement numbers then. They sound pretty key to making sure data arrives correctly.
Oh, they are fundamental. Imagine you're sending a really long email, but you have to break it into tiny postcards.
Okay.
TCP treats the data stream as just a sequence of bytes. Every single byte gets a sequence number. It's like numbering every single character on your postcard.
Every single byte. Wow.
Every byte. So when the sender sends a chunk of data, a segment, it puts the sequence number of the first byte in that segment in the header.
Right.
The receiver uses these sequence numbers to put the bytes back in the correct order, even if the packets arrive jumbled up.
And the acknowledgement number, how does that fit in?
The acknowledgement number, or ACK number, is what the receiver sends back. It essentially says, I have received all the bytes up to this sequence number, and the next byte I'm expecting is this one.
So it's always acknowledging the next expected byte, not the last one received.
Generally, yes. That's how the sender knows everything up to that point got through okay. If a packet gets lost, the receiver will keep sending ACKs for the last byte it did receive correctly. The sender sees these duplicate ACKs and knows something went wrong.
And that triggers a retransmission.
Exactly. It knows which byte sequence needs to be resent. This byte-level numbering is what allows TCP to guarantee in order complete delivery.
Okay, so sequence numbers and ACKs are the core. But you mentioned TCP has a whole toolkit for reliability. What else is in there?
Well, besides the sequence ACK mechanism for order and detecting loss, and the retransmissions we just mentioned, there are checksums.
For data corruption?
Yep. Each segment has a checksum calculated over the header and data. If the receiver calculates a different checksum, it knows the packet got corrupted in transit and just discards it. The sender will eventually retransmit it based on the lack of an ACK.
Okay.
Then there's flow control, making sure the sender doesn't flood the receiver. And related but different, there's congestion control, making sure the sender doesn't flood the network itself. All these work together.
Let's unpack flow control. The sliding window, how does that work? Sounds like it stops the sender overwhelming the receiver.
It does. Imagine the receiver has a buffer, like a bucket, to hold incoming data before the application reads it. The receiver tells the sender how much empty space is currently in that buffer.
Ah, okay.
This amount of space is the receive window. The sender is only allowed to send up to that amount of data before it has to wait for an ACK that also updates the window size.
So the window size can change.
Constantly. As the application reads data from the buffer, the receiver advertises a larger window. If the application is slow and the buffer fills up, the receiver advertises a smaller window, potentially even 0.
And that's the sliding part. The amount of allowed unacknowledged data shifts.
Exactly. The sender maintains this window of sequence numbers it's allowed to send. As it gets ACKs, the window slides forward, allowing new data to be sent. It lets the sender keep data flowing without waiting for an ACK for every single packet, which is much more efficient.
But you mentioned sometimes it's not efficient.
Well, if the receiver is really struggling and keeps advertising tiny windows, the sender might end up sending lots of very small packets. Each packet has header overhead, so sending tiny amounts frequently isn't great. It's called the silly window syndrome.
Okay, so what happens if the receiver is totally swamped and advertises a window of 0? Does everything just grind to a halt?
It seems like it would, right? The sender gets the 0 window ACK and stops sending data, but the connection isn't dead.
So how does it restart?
The receiver, even with a full buffer, will still send ACKs if, say, the sender retransmits something. But more importantly, the sender doesn't just wait forever. It enters something called persist mode.
Persist mode.
Yeah. After a timeout, the sender sends a tiny packet, just 1 byte usually, called a 0 window probe. It's basically asking, hey, is your window still 0?
Poking the receiver.
Exactly. The receiver has to ACK this probe, and in that ACK, it will include its current window size. If it's still 0, the sender backs off, waits longer, usually doubling the wait time, and sends another probe. If the window has opened up, the ACK will show a non-zero window, and the sender can resume sending data.
Clever. Prevents deadlock.
Precisely. Without probes, if the ACK that would have opened the window got lost, both sides could wait forever.
Now, you mentioned the window size. The standard TCP header only has 16 bits for that, right? But that's only 64 kilobytes. That seems tiny for modern networks.
It is. On high-speed, high-latency networks, what we call high-bandwidth delay product or BDP links, 64 KB is nowhere near enough to keep the pipe full.
So how do we get around that?
With the window scale option, it's an extension defined back in RFC 1323. During the initial 3-way handshake, both sides can include this option in their SYN packets.
Okay.
The option contains a shift count, say, n. This means the 16-bit window field in all subsequent packets should be interpreted as being left shifted by n bits.
So it's like a multiplier.
Essentially, yes. A scale factor of 7, for instance, means you multiply the value in the window field by 2 to the power of 7, or 128. This allows for much, much larger effective window sizes, easily into the megabytes or even gigabytes, which is necessary for saturating fast links.
Is this common now?
Oh yeah, it's enabled by default on pretty much all modern operating systems. You have to explicitly turn it off, usually.
And if I'm looking at packets, say in Wireshark, how does this show up? You mentioned TCP window full.
Right. Seeing TCP window full in Wireshark is a flag indicating the sender received a 0 window advertisement. If you look at the TCP header details, you'll see the win field showing the advertised window, which might be 0. And if scaling is used, a WS field showing the negotiated window scale factor.
Got it. Okay, so data gets there, receiver isn't overwhelmed, but packets take different paths, right? They can arrive all mixed up. How does TCP deliver a nice, clean, ordered stream to the application?
Again, it comes back to those sequence numbers. The receiver's TCP stack maintains a buffer for incoming segments. When a segment arrives, it looks at the sequence number.
If it's the next one expected.
If it's the next sequential byte, TCP passes the data up to the application or holds it if the application isn't reading fast enough.
What if it's like way ahead, a packet from the future?
If a segment arrives with a sequence number later than the next expected one, TCP knows there's a gap. It will usually hold on to that out-of-order segment in its buffer.
Waiting for the missing piece.
Exactly. And it will keep sending ACKs for the last in-order byte it received. These are those duplicate ACKs we talked about. 3 duplicate ACKs is usually the trigger for the sender to realize a segment was lost and retransmit it quickly. That's called fast retransmit.
Does the receiver tell the sender which pieces it has, even if they're out of order?
Yes, that's where selective acknowledgement, or SACK, comes in. It's another TCP option. With SEK, the receiver can include information in its ACKs specifying blocks of data it has received beyond the main cumulative ACK point.
Ah, so the sender doesn't have to guess or retransmit stuff the receiver already got.
Precisely. SACK makes recovery from multiple lost packets within one window much more efficient. Instead of potentially retransmitting the whole window from the first lost packet, the sender only resends the specific segments identified as missing by the SACK information. Most systems use SACK now.
Makes sense. Lots of clever optimizations. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to congestion control. You said it's different from flow control. How so?
Right. Flow control is about the direct conversation between one sender and one receiver, preventing the sender from overwhelming the receiver's buffer. Congestion control is about the sender trying not to overwhelm the network itself, the routers, the shared links along the path.
So it's about being a good citizen on the internet highway.
That's a great way to put it. If everyone just blasted data as fast as their connection allowed, the routers in the middle would get swamped, start dropping packets like crazy, and everyone's performance would plummet. Congestion control tries to prevent this tragedy of the commons.
How does a sender even know if the network is congested? It can't exactly ask the routers.
It infers it, mainly from packet loss or sometimes increasing delay. The specific ways it reacts define the different congestion control algorithms.
Okay, let's talk about those. Reno, CVIC, BBR, they sound quite different. How does something like Reno work?
Reno and its slightly improved version of Reno are kind of the classic examples. They are loss-based. The core idea is additive increase, multiplicative decrease, AIMD.
AIMD, okay.
It starts cautiously in a phase called slow start, rapidly increasing its sending rate, actually exponentially despite the name, until it detects loss or hits a threshold. Then it transitions to congestion avoidance, where it increases the rate more slowly, additively adding roughly 1 segment per round trip time.
And the multiplicative decrease.
When it detects packet loss, usually via those duplicate ACKs or a timeout, it assumes congestion and drastically cuts its sending rate, typically at halves the rate. Then it starts increasing slowly again.
So it probes for bandwidth, backs off hard when it hits a limit, then creeps back up.
Pretty much. Reno improved how it handles recovering from multiple losses within one window, but the basic AIMD approach is the same. It can be a bit conservative, especially on links with occasional random loss that isn't really due to congestion.
Okay, so how does CUBIC improve on that? You said it's the default in Linux now.
CUBIC is also loss-based, reacting to packet loss by reducing its rate. But its increase phase is different. It uses a cubic function based on the time elapsed since the last congestion event.
A cubic function. How does that help?
The shape of the cubic curve means that right after a loss, CUBIC is quite conservative, increasing slowly. But as time passes and it gets further away from the point where loss occurred, it becomes much more aggressive, increasing its rate rapidly to try and find the real new capacity. Then, as it gets close to the previous maximum rate, it slows down again, becoming concave to probe more carefully.
So it's trying to be faster on high bandwidth links, but safer near the previous bottleneck.
Exactly. It's designed to be more stable and scale better on high-speed, long-distance networks compared to Reno's strictly linear increase. It still halves its rate on loss, similar to Reno, though.
Interesting. And then there's BBR. That one sounds fundamentally different model-based.
Yes, BBR bottleneck bandwidth and RTT developed by Google takes a different tack. Instead of relying primarily on loss to signal congestion, it actively tries to measure the network path's characteristics.
How does it do that?
It periodically measures the bottleneck bandwidth, the maximum data rate the tightest link on the path can sustain, and the minimum round-trip time, min RTT, the propagation delay without queuing.
Okay, so it builds a model of the path.
Right. And its goal is to pace its sending rate to match the estimated bottleneck bandwidth while also trying to keep the amount of data sitting in router queues to a minimum, targeting just enough to keep the pipe full based on the min RTT.
So it aims for high throughput and low latency, tackling buffer bloat.
That's the core idea. By avoiding filling up router buffers unnecessarily, it tries to prevent the high latency often associated with loss-based algorithms pushing buffers to their limits. Google reported big throughput gains on YouTube and lower delays.
Any downsides?
Early versions sometimes struggled with fairness when competing with loss-based flows like CBBC, as it might not back off as much in the presence of loss. Newer versions, BBRv2 and v3, are incorporating loss signals and ECN, explicit congestion notification, more directly to try and address these fairness concerns and be better network citizens.
Fascinating how this is still evolving. And you can actually switch these algorithms.
On Linux, yes. You can use systeal to change net.ipv4.tcp congestion control. You could set it to cubic or BBR or others your kernel supports. Lets you experiment.
Cool. Okay, we've covered data flow and congestion. What about the lifecycle? Starting and stopping connections. The TCP state machine sounds complex.
It looks complex visually, maybe, but it's logical. It just defines all the possible states a connection can be in, from non-existent to fully established to completely closed. And the events, like receiving a SYN or sending a SYN, that cause transitions between states, it's all laid out in the RFCs.
Can we walk through the main states? Like, how does a server even start listening?
Okay, so everything starts as closed, no connection. A server wanting to accept the connections uses system calls like socket, bind, and then listen. Calling listen puts the socket into the listen state. It's now passively waiting for someone to knock on the door.
And the client knocks by sending.
The client calls connect.
Yeah.
This causes it to send that first SYN packet we talked about and puts the client socket into the SYN sent state.
Waiting for the SYN ACK.
Right. When the server in listen receives the SYN, it sends back the SYN ACK and moves that specific connection, not the listening socket itself, into the SYN received state. It's waiting for the final ACK of the handshake. The client gets the SES and ACK, sends the final ACK, and transitions to established. Data transfer can now begin from the client side. When the server gets that final ACK, it also moves to established. Now we have a two-way street.
Perfect. Now, how does it end gracefully? The fin packets.
Yes, the fin finish flag is used for graceful closure. Let's say the client application decides it's done sending data. It initiates an active close.
What happens then?
The client's TCP sends a fin packet and enters the fin wait 1 state, waiting for an ACK for its fin.
Does the server stop sending data immediately?
Not necessarily. When the server receives the fin, it sends back an ACK for that fin. This moves the server into the close wait state. The connection is now half closed. The server knows the client won't send any more data, but the server application can still send data back to the client if it needs to.
Ah, okay, so the server application needs to react to.
Exactly. Once the server application is also done and closes its end of the socket, the server's TCP sends its own FN packet to the client. This moves the server to the last ACK state, waiting for the final ACK from the client.
What about the client during this? It got the ACK for its fin.
Right. When the client, which was in fin wait 1, receives the ACK for its fin, it moves to fin wait 2. It's now just waiting for the server's fin.
Okay.
When the client in fin wait 2 receives the server's fin, it sends back the final ACK. Now, instead of going straight to closed, the client enters the crucial time wait state.
And the server?
The server, in last state, receives that final ACK from the client and immediately transitions to closed. Connection gone on the server side.
But the client lingers in time wait. Why? What's that for? Seems inefficient.
It's actually super important for reliability. Two main reasons. First, what if that final ACK from the client to the server gets lost?
The server would still be in last state, waiting.
Exactly. It would eventually time out and retransmit its MFIN. If the client had already closed, it wouldn't know what to do. By staying in time wait, typically for 2 times the maximum segment lifetime, or 2MSL, maybe 60 seconds, the client is still around to resend that final ACK, ensuring the server closes cleanly.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second reason?
It prevents delayed packets from a previous connection instance, using the same IP addresses and port numbers, from being mistaken as belonging to a new connection instance that starts up quickly. The 2MSL wait ensures any old duplicates wandering the network have likely expired.
Got it. So time wait is a safety net. And you can see these states using tools like netstat or SS.
Yep. Netstat-N or SSN will show you the state of all your TCP sockets. Seeing a lot of sockets stuck in close wait on a server is often a sign that the server application isn't closing its end of the connection after the client sends a FANE, which can leak resources.
Really useful for debugging. Okay, let's switch to security. SYN floods. You mentioned the handshake. How does that become an attack vector?
It exploits that intermediate SYN received state. Remember, when the server gets a SYN, it sends SYN ACK and has to remember some information about this half-open connection waiting for the final ACK.
It allocates some resources.
Right. Usually it puts an entry in a queue, the SYN backlog. An attacker just sends a flood of SYN packets, often from spoofed IP addresses, but never sends the final ACK to complete the handshake.
So the server's backlog queue fills up with these bogus half connections.
Exactly. It uses up memory and fills the queue slots. Once the queue is full, the server can't accept any new legitimate SYN packets because there's no space left. It's a denial of service attack legitimate users can't connect.
Nasty. How do systems defend against this?
There are a few ways. You can increase the size of the SYN backlog queue, TCP max and backlog in Linux, so it takes more SYNs to fill it. You can also reduce the time the server waits for the final ACK before discarding the half-open connection, TC Sinacre trees. Firewalls can sometimes filter floods.
Is there a more robust way?
Yes, the most common and effective defense is SYN cookies.
SYN cookies. Sounds tasty, but probably not.
No. It's a clever technique invented by Dan Bernstein. When SYN cookies are enabled, the server doesn't allocate any state or put anything in the backlog when it receives a SYN.
So it doesn't remember the SYN at all.
Not directly. Instead, when it sends the SYN ACK back, it crafts a special initial sequence number. This sequence number, the cookie, cryptographically encodes information about the connection, like the client-server IPs and ports, and a timestamp all mixed with a secret key only the server knows.
Whoa.
Then it just sends the SYN ACK and forgets about it. If the connection is legitimate, the client will reply with the final ACK, and that ACK will contain the sequence number it received, the cookie, in the acknowledgement field.
So the server can check that cookie.
Exactly. The server takes the information from the incoming ACK, combines it with the sorts of destination details in the current time, recomputes the hash with its secret key, and checks if it matches the cookie value sent back by the client. If it matches, the server knows this ACK corresponds to a valid SYN ACK it sent recently, and only then does it allocate the connection state and move to established.
That's brilliant. It doesn't store state until the connection is verified, completely sidestepping the backlog exhaustion.
Precisely. It's stateless during the vulnerable phase. Most systems, including Linux, TCP cookies 1, enable this automatically when they detect the SYN backlog might be overflowing.
Very cool. Okay, back to performance. Delayed ACKs in Nagel's algorithm. They sound like optimizations, but you hear they can cause problems sometimes.
They are optimizations designed to reduce network traffic, but yes, their interaction can sometimes bite you, especially with interactive applications.
What does delayed ACK do?
The idea is simple. Instead of sending an ACK immediately for every single data segment received, the receiver waits a short time, like up to 200 milliseconds maybe. If another data segment arrives within that time, or if the receiver has data of its own to send back, it can piggyback the ACK onto that outgoing data packet, saving a whole packet. The rule is generally ACK at least every second segment or within the time limit.
Okay, reduces ACK traffic.
Yeah.
And Nagel's algorithm.
Nagel's algorithm is on the sender side. It tries to prevent sending lots of tiny packets, which is inefficient, header over head. If the application writes just a small amount of data, and there's still previously sent data that hasn't been acknowledged yet, Nagel's algorithm says, hold on.
Don't send the tinygram yet.
Right. It buffers the small write, waiting either until it accumulates a full segment's worth of data, MSS maximum segment size, or until it receives an ACK for the outstanding data. Then it sends the accumulated data.
So how do these two cause trouble together?
Imagine an interactive session, like SSH or Telnet. You type one character, the application writes that tiny character. Nagel says, whoa, small write, and I'm waiting for an ACK for previous data, let's buffer this.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the receiver gets the previous data, but its delayed ACK timer is running. It's waiting maybe 200 meters before sending the ACK. So the sender is waiting for the ACK before Nagel lets it send the character, and the receiver is waiting for its timer before sending the ACK. You can get these noticeable little delays for every small interaction. It feels sluggish.
I see. Like hitting a key and waiting that fraction of a second for it to echo back.
Exactly. It's a classic interaction noted even in the early RFCs. That's why applications that need low latency for small transfers, like games or SSH, often disable Nagel's algorithm using a socket option called TCP and no delay.
Gotcha. Trade efficiency for responsiveness in those cases. What about TCP keep alive? Is that related to keeping connections performant?
Not directly for performance, more for robustness and cleaning up dead connections. It's an optional feature.
How does it work?
If a TCP connection is completely idle, no data flowing in either direction for a long time, the default in Linux is 2 hours, believe it or not, the keep alive mechanism can kick in, if enabled.
2 hours seems long.
It is, by default. You can tune it. Anyway, After this idle period, the system sends a keep alive probe packet to the other end. It's usually an empty ACK segment or sometimes 1 byte of garbage data, designed purely to elicit a response.
What happens if the other side is alive?
If the peer is alive and the connection is fine, it just sends back an ACK. The local system resets the idle timer. All good.
And if it's dead? Or the network path is broken?
If the probe gets no response, the system waits a bit. Controlled by TCP keep alive interval, default 75 seconds, and sends another probe. It repeats this a certain number of times. TCP keep alive probes, default 9. If none of the probes get a response, the local system concludes the connection is dead and cleans it up, closing the socket and releasing resources.
So it's mainly for detecting zombie connections on otherwise idle links.
Pretty much. It prevents resources from being tied up indefinitely by connections that have died silently without a proper FFINE or RST exchange.
Speaking of FFINE and RST, can you just quickly clarify the difference? When do you see one versus the other?
Sure. FFINE is for the graceful shutdown. It's part of that 4-way handshake we discussed. I'm finished sending, are you? Leads to states like fin wait and time wait.
The polite way to hang up.
Exactly. RST, or reset, is the abrupt hang-up. It means something is wrong, connection aborted immediately. Both sides should discard any state for the connection right away. No waiting, no further ACKs.
When would a system send an RST?
Common reasons are receiving a packet for a connection that doesn't exist, like hitting a port with no listening service, or receiving a packet that's somehow invalid for the current connection state, maybe a wrong sequence number when not expected. Or if an application explicitly requests an abortive close, you typically don't see RST in a normal clean connection termination. That's what FIN is for.
Perfect clarity. Okay, this has been super insightful. For people managing Linux systems, how much can they actually tune this stuff? You mentioned systil.
Oh, quite a bit. Linux exposes a lot of TCP IP stack parameters via systil. We've touched on some already, like net.ipv4.tcp congestion control to pick Reno, CBIC, BBR, etc., and net.ipv4.tcp sing cookies.
What are some other two ones? Buffers, maybe?
Definitely buffers. .net.core.rmemax and net.core.wmemax set the absolute maximum receipt and send buffer sizes the kernel will allow for any socket. Then net.ipv4.tcprm and net.ipv4.tcpwm control the default and maximum sizes specifically for TCP sockets. These are often crucial for performance on fast or long latency links.
What else? Window scaling. SEACK.
Yep, you'd want to ensure net.ipv4.tcp window scaling and net.ipv4.tcp SAC are both set to 1, which they usually are by default. Net.ipv4.tcp M2 probing can sometimes help if you have path MTU discovery issues.
Keep alive.
You can tune those too. TCP keep alive time, the initial idle time. TCP keep alive NTVL, interval between probes, and TCP keep alive probes, number of probes before giving up.
What about timeouts or retransmissions?
There's net.ipv4.tcpm timeout, which controls how long sockets stay in fen wait 2, and things like net.ipv4.tcply retrans or TCP-trees to affect retransmission behavior, though tweaking those often requires deeper knowledge. Even the default queuing disciplines set by net.core.defaultDisk, like using FQ, which the BBR folks often recommend, can impact TCT performance.
Wow, lots of levers. Could you give an example, say, tuning for a 10 Gbp server?
Sure. On a fast network like 10 gig, especially if there's some latency, you need large TCP windows to fill the pipe. So first, you'd likely increase the maximum system buffer limits, 60L-W net.core.rmmax 67108864 and net.core.wmmax 67108864, that's 64 MB.
Okay, raise the ceiling.
Then you'd adjust the TCP-specific buffer settings, maybe 60L-DL-W net.ipv4.tcprm 40 096 87380 3355 4432 bubit, and the same for TCP-WMEM. The set's minimum, default, and maximum 32 MB here, buffer sizes per TCP socket.
Allows for much bigger windows.
Exactly. You double-check window scaling and SEK are on, maybe switch the congestion control to BBR and the queue discipline to FQ if appropriate for the workload. sysdl-w net.ipv4.tcp congestion control BBR and sysdl-w net.core.default-tcp-FQ. This lets TCP really stretch its legs on that fast network, though honestly modern kernels do a lot of auto-tuning, so just raising the max limits might be enough sometimes.
That's really practical. Okay, final area, troubleshooting. If things feel slow and you suspect TCP, where do you start digging?
Good question. It's usually a process of elimination. First, check the basics. Are you seeing retransmissions or timeouts?
How do you check that?
Tools like SSS or NextStatMSS give you summaries. Look for counters like retransmits or timeouts. Procnet's MPIC has raw TCP stats too. High numbers point towards loss or heavy congestion.
Yeah, what next?
Look at the connection details. SSI is great for this on Linux. It shows you the current congestion window, current, the receiver's advertised window, the round-trip time, RTT, and how much data is unacknowledged.
What are you looking for there?
Is the current really small compared to what the link should support, the BDP? That could be congestion control backing off or maybe buffer limits. Is the receiver advertising a zero window? That's flow control kicking in, the receiver is slow.
Makes sense. What about the network path itself?
Use ping to check basic reachability and get a rough idea of RTT and packet loss. Use traceroute, or MTR, to see the path and latency hops. High RTT directly limits single-stream throughput. Even tiny amounts of packet loss can kill performance for algorithms like Reno or CUBC.
Tools like iPerf.
Definitely. Use iPerf or NetPerf to measure actual throughput. Try single stream versus multiple streams. Sometimes multiple streams can overcome limitations faced by a single stream, pointing towards window size or congestion control behavior.
And the ultimate tool, packet captures.
If you really need to see what's happening, yes. Capture traffic with TCP dump or Wireshark. Then you can visually inspect the flow. Are there lots of duplicate ACKs? SCK blocks, zero window updates, long delays between packets. Wireshark's expert system often flags common TCP problems. Look for that TCP window full message we talked about.
Don't forget checking the settings too, right?
Absolutely. Verify the system settings. Is window scaling on? Is SCK enabled? What congestion control algorithm is active? Are the buffer limits adequate for the RTT and bandwidth?
And the application itself.
Good point. Sometimes the bottleneck isn't TCP or the network, but the application. Is it doing tiny writes frequently, maybe interacting badly with Nagel? Is the receiving application slow to read data from the socket buffer, causing flow control issues?
Okay, that's a solid checklist. You had that interview scenario. Low throughput on a high RTT link. How would you apply this?
Right. High RTT, low throughput. First thought. Bandwidth delay product. If the RTT is, say, 200 meters, even a 1 GB PSC link needs a BDP of about 25 megabytes to stay full.
So window size is suspect number one.
Exactly. Is TCP window scaling enabled on both ends? You need it on both for it to work. What are the configured buffer sizes? TCP-mem, TCP-WM, RMMX, RMMX. Are they large enough to allow a window close to the BDP?
That also.
Check for packet loss using ping. High RTT links are often more prone to loss, and loss kills throughput, especially for CU by Reno. If loss is ruled out and window size seems limiting, maybe try increasing the receive buffer on the destination machine.
What tools would you mention?
Definitely ping for loss RTT, down SSD2I, to check current window T2N DRTT.systol, to check settings, to iPerf to measure the actual throughput achieved. And maybe mention Wireshark for deep analysis if needed. Showing you know the tools and the thought process is key.
Excellent walkthrough. This has been incredibly comprehensive. To wrap it up, what are the absolute key things you want people to remember about TCP?
I think the main thing is appreciating the complexity and cleverness built into it. TCP does so much behind the scenes, the handshake, sequence numbers, ACKs, windows, congestion control, state management, all to give us this illusion of a simple, reliable pipe over the messy internet. Understanding those mechanisms isn't just academic. It's crucial for building robust applications and for figuring out why things are slow or broken.
It really is foundational.
It is. And knowing how it works helps you troubleshoot, helps you tune, helps you have informed conversations about network performance.
Okay, final thought for our listeners. Consider this. We talked about Reno, CUBIC, BBR. This constant evolution of congestion control algorithms moving from just reacting to loss to actively modeling the network. What does that tell us about the ongoing challenge of squeezing efficiency and fairness out of our global network infrastructure? As demand keeps exploding, what kind of innovations might we need next?
That's a great question to ponder.
Definitely something to think about. Maybe explore some of those tuning parameters or dig into a specific algorithm based on your own needs. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.